It is clear that cities face many perceived and real barriers in embedding gender equality into their procurement practices. This part of the training details how cities can respond to those barriers and implement gender-responsive public procurement processes and practices. So first of all, responding to some of those big barriers. First, this is allowed. The EU legal framework for procurement has evolved into a comprehensive set of rules and principles governing the award of public contracts. The 2014 procurement directives allow cities to use procurement as a lever to realise wider social goals, of which gender equality is one. Second, this is fair. The basic gender equality challenge is that men, as a group, have more power and resources than women. But successful gender equality work must also take into account how people's gender interacts with other factors, such as age, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and disability. Gender-responsive public procurement can be a tool for diversity and inclusion. Third, gender procurement is strategic procurement. Municipalities may pursue gender-responsive public procurement as part of a broader policy on strategic procurement, encompassing environmental and other social objectives. While some organisations fear that these different objectives will compete, in many cases there are synergies between environmental goals and gender equality and mainstreaming. Fourth, this does not cost more. Actually, gender-responsive public procurement does not necessarily imply higher costs, but it does require knowledge and capacity. The changes that you make in your approach to procurement will lead to cost savings elsewhere in the system. And fifth, after completing the following training, you will have the skills to undertake procurement differently and embedding gender equality into procurement. In URBACT's online course on strategic procurement, we introduced the cycle of procurement, the 6 steps cities need to go through to embed social and environmental considerations into procurement. The steps for gender-responsive public procurement are exactly the same. One of our strategic procurement modules was about ensuring governance mechanisms and strategy are in place to enable social and environmental outcomes to be embedded in procurement. For gender-responsive public procurement, the principles are the same. Cities need to do 4 things. First, check the overarching strategies of their country, region, or city and identify whether there is a focus on gender equality. Second, explore existing procurement strategies and identify whether there is a focus upon gender responsiveness. This may be included in outcomes around social responsibility. Third, if there is not a coherent link between procurement and gender in national and local policy, then cities need to start to make the link themselves by identifying the types of gender-responsive outcomes they want to embed and realise through the procurement process. For example, this could include increasing the percentage of women in a construction contract workforce or increasing the number of girls and women engaging with a public health service. Fourth, once the outcomes have been identified, then a programme of capacity building and training around gender-responsive public procurement needs to be implemented. The focus here should not just be upon procurement teams. There needs to be a link between procurement teams, commissioners, those people designing goods and services, equality bodies, and those working in economic development.
Another of our strategic public procurement modules was about measuring spend and encouraging cities to understand where their spend goes, geographically, sectorally, and in business-type terms. Spend analysis is still important in the context of gender-responsive public procurement, but in a slightly different way. Cities need to benchmark and develop clear indicators at an early stage. And these need to link back to the outcomes in the previous stage and may include indicators around such things as the number of staff in the municipality and in the supplier receiving training in gender issues relevant to the contract, targets for recruitment and promotion to achieve gender balance in the team performing the contract, targets to reduce the gender pay gap under the contract, and specific gender considerations in the procurement of goods such as uniforms and equipment, and in the procurement of services and works around infrastructure. These are, of course, just examples of indicators you could benchmark and develop. A further element of our strategic public procurement modules was around commissioning. This is the process used to design goods and services, which can also be called pre-procurement. It's at this stage where cities should be actively considering the relevance of social, environmental, and gender-responsive outcomes to the nature of the goods or services they're procuring. Indeed, there are a number of steps that cities need to go through if they're going to embed gender-responsive outcomes during the commissioning phase. The first thing cities need to do when designing the good or service is to reflect upon whether the contract has a gender perspective, who the ultimate beneficiaries of the contract are, and if they include both women and men in all their diversity, and whether there are differences in situations of those women and men, which will mean a tailoring of the delivery of that contract. These should also explore how men, women, boys and girls currently use the service that's being procured. It's important to look for data, to consult widely, and to not make assumptions, for instance, based on past service use. Once cities have decided it is relevant to include gender-responsive public procurement in their contract opportunity, then the second thing they need to do during this pre-procurement is some initial market engagement. This is where procurers identify businesses that may be interested in bidding for the contract and talk to them about their wider requirements. This provides cities not only with the opportunity to understand the types of businesses that might be able to deliver upon the requirements of the contract, but also to explain the importance that gender responsiveness plays in their procurement process and will play in the decision-making around the successful supplier. The third thing cities need to do is to set out the scope of the goods or services which they're looking to procure, and if relevant, set out requirements around gender responsiveness. Procurers could give the contract opportunity a title that explicitly refers to gender equality. For example, design, build and manage sports centres that promote equal participation. Or they could directly refer to the needs of men and women in the delivery of the service. For example, in a mobility service, there'll be differences in journey times and usage requirements for public transport. Then the fourth thing that cities need to decide upon during this commissioning phase is the type of public procurement procedure they're going to utilise and whether to divide the contract into lots. Some procedures, such as competitive dialogue and innovation partnerships, are more about developing relationships with suppliers and will potentially enable a greater focus upon gender responsiveness. Breaking a contract into smaller lots can help ensure the participation of a wide range of bidders, including small and medium-sized enterprises, social enterprises, and women-led businesses.
Another of our strategic procurement modules was around the tender itself and decision-making of the winning supplier. In the case of social and environmental considerations, this is where procurers ask a range of questions around social and environmental value and the additional benefits potential suppliers are going to deliver. For gender-responsive public procurement, this is about including one or more criteria around gender responsiveness. There are generally 4 types of criteria that can be utilised for gender-responsive public procurement. First, cities can use exclusion grounds, where suppliers are ruled out of a procurement procedure if they do not meet certain requirements. For example, suppliers can be ruled out if they do not provide evidence that women and men are paid equally for the same type of work. Another example could be that suppliers can be ruled out if they have more than 250 employees and do not have an equalities plan. Second, cities can use selection criteria, which can address considerations around the technical capability, professional skills, and qualifications of potential suppliers. For example, to deliver a community health service, a supplier would have to demonstrate prior experience in reaching both men and women. Third, cities can use technical specifications to ensure the different needs of women and men are included in the technical parts of the delivery of the goods or services. For example, in the procurement of social housing, planning and design may affect men and women differently. Older women and lone parents might need different sized apartments and communal spaces. Safety features could include street lighting and access to connecting public transport. These could form part of the technical specification. Fourth, cities can use specific award criteria around gender, so long as they are relevant to the nature of the good or service being procured. For example, if they were procuring for temporary workers through an employment agency, then they could include an award criteria around the gender equality of those temporary workers. The final step of our strategic procurement modules was around monitoring and was recognised as the most difficult for cities to implement. When a supplier commits to delivering social and environmental considerations, then it should be a condition of contract. The same applies to gender responsive public procurement. Here, cities should link back to the indicators that were identified earlier in the cycle of procurement and monitor the performance of the successful supplier against those indicators.
That concludes this part of the training. In the next part of our module, we will explore places, Vienna and the Basque Country, where gender responsive public procurement is being effectively implemented. Thank you.